Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our lecture tonight in the series being held in conjunction with Hippos, the exhibition next door. And you are welcome to go there after this lecture. It's open until 10 o'clock. And we're having a special event on Saturday. We're having an actual horse come here to the American School. And this is a family event, which is already pre-booked. If you want to see the horse, he will be around. And we're going to extend we're trying to get him back. I should say. The horse's name is Stella. And if she has a good time, we'll try to get her to come back again and have more family days, and we'll announce those. So I also want to bring to your attention the fact that our wonderful Medici Riccardi horse, the star of our show, is only here till March 6th. He has to go back to Florence for an exhibition on Donatello. So if you haven't seen this magnificent masterpiece of Greek sculpture, you have until March 6th to go over and see him. Now, it's a great pleasure to have Carolyn Willocks here tonight, because she is a great horsewoman, having ridden horses all over the world almost. She's an assistant professor at Mount Royal University, which is in the town of Calgary in Canada. This is the Wild West of Canada. And if you haven't heard of it, one of the greatest events in Canada, held every year, kind of like the Olympics in July, is the world's largest rodeo. It's known as the Calgary Stampede, and it's a 10-day event that attracts 1 million people. If you're interested, they have hippic events, not unlike the ancient Olympic Games. Although I don't think the ancient Olympics had barrel racing for girls or chuck wagon racing. Some of those are some of the special events there. Anyway, tickets are now on sale if you want to get to Calgary in July. Here's your chance. So Professor Willocks has her MA and PhD from the University of Calgary. For her MA, she worked on the Greek war horse, and for her PhD, it was entitled From Step to Stable, Horse and Horsemanship in the Ancient World. This led to her first book, which I have here. It's a wonderful resource if you want to get a whole survey of the horses in the ancient world, the horse in the ancient world, from Bucephalus to the Hippodrome. And I've been mining this book. You can see I have all these tabs in it for information about horses. And then that was in 2016, and then the next year she published a more general book on the Greek warrior and hoplite and horses. She may be the only recently junior professor who, when she was hired and had startup funds, went out and asked for a full-scale hoplite shield so she could do this in her empirical research. Most of her research is empirical, and it comes from her great riding experience, so she could ride out with the shield. She also told me a story of wearing medieval armor, which was so difficult to ride in that it resulted in a broken knee. But I hope she'll have pictures of this tonight. If you go online and Google her name, you'll find some wonderful videos, and I like the one on mules and donkeys. We don't deal with those equids in our exhibition. They're sort of the lower class of the equines, but she's kind of resuscitated them in this video and telling us how important donkeys were in the ancient world. So you might want to look at that. Professor Willocks is also a field archaeologist. She's worked at Antioch at Kragum in Turkey, and also with the Canadians at Stymphalus here in Greece. Among other distinctions, she is the vice president of the Equine History Collective. So I'm very pleased to have her here, and we will have a reception as usual downstairs. I welcome our very large sign-up online audience. You may submit your questions during or at the end of the lecture on the chat, and we will try to get to as many as possible. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Willocks.
I am technologically inept, so Konstantinos to the rescue. Thank you. It's the reason why I study ancient horses, not ancient technology. Ah, I see. Very clever. Thank you. Well, it is a great pleasure to be here. I am very honored that Jennifer asked me to be a part of the Hippos exhibit, which is fantastic. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I really recommend you do. There are some wonderful pieces in there celebrating the role of the horse, certainly in Athenian history, but also sort of the ancient world as well, and giving us a great idea of just how important this animal was. So I was thrilled to be able to see it in person, especially in our ongoing pandemic world, and certainly it is a huge honor to be part of this lecture series. I feel a bit like the new kid on the block, so I'm hoping everyone enjoys some of the stories I have to share tonight as I take a bit of a practical approach to looking at the role of the horse in the ancient world, but in human history as well. And it's literally taken me to some pretty far reaches of our globe as I set out in a very tangible quest to figure out why the horse is so important and how we can use the horse to understand our history and our relationship with the natural world. This photo was taken in the before times, the pre-pandemic world, in Kyrgyzstan. On my little gray stallion, a reminder that there are still places in the world where you can escape your smartphones and the constant pressing needs of email and instantaneous responses. And as I rode through really what was part of the ancient Silk Road with not a lot of roads in the wilderness, it gives a very sort of honest idea of what travel must have been like in the pre-modern world, and just why the horse was such an integral part of this. There we go. So until relatively recently, it was a common sight to see horses out and about in both urban and rural areas. They performed a variety of roles in our lives. Although not everyone would have owned horses themselves or interacted with them in a sort of face-to-face manner, they were nonetheless a familiar part of the landscape. There was an understanding of what a horse was and how they fit into our lives and social structures. Although a daily reliance on the horse can still be found in some parts of the world, especially in places like Central Asia, life has largely pushed them into particular niche roles, especially in Europe and North America. They're companions, they're pets, they are very expensive lawnmowers and fertilizers. Of course, they do still serve in a military context in some capacities as well. But these niche roles that horses now fulfill, it can make it difficult for us to visualize the horse as a consistent part of the landscape, especially the urban landscape. Most of us don't run into horses when we're walking down the street. It creates a separation between the horse and us, and this can make it difficult to visualize anything different. Even in Calgary, a place that celebrates the horse and calls itself sort of the heart of the New West, and yes, we have our big rodeo, and we have a big show jumping facility, and theoretically I have been told that there is supposed to be a law that businesses should have hitching rails outside of them so that you can ride your horse to the bank and tie it up outside. But then there's a contradictory rule saying that you're only allowed to ride a horse in downtown Calgary during the stampede. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. But generally speaking, you're not expecting to run into a living, breathing horse as you go about your daily suburban or downtown business. But for the residents of ancient Athens and many other parts of the ancient world, horses were a part of their landscape. They were a part of their environment, not just as they pranced and posed on civic monuments or private artistic commissions and public art, but as living, breathing beings that moved through the streets and public spaces. It created a sort of complex, layered horse-human relationship, one that I think we've not really stopped to think about, because we so often view the Greek horse in its context as a status symbol, or an object, or sort of semiotic representation of something, rather than thinking about the horse itself as, well, a horse, let alone as individual horses with their own quirks and personalities. And believe me, horses have a lot of quirks and personalities. And when we do take that step and begin to consider the equine or equestrian side of things, our readings and interpretations of ancient equestrianism are often colored by our own experiences and ideas about what horses, training, and riding should be. In other words, we view ancient equestrianism through specific modern lenses based on the role the horse has come to play in 21st century society. And whether we are conscious of this or not, we tend to judge or evaluate ancient horses and their riders against a modern set of standards. And just to sort of give you an idea, this is that one time a year where you're going to see lots of horses in downtown Calgary. That's me in the front row on the middle and the big chestnut horse. That was my wonderful horse, Bert. In a full medieval dress. The Stampede Parade, I think, is the second longest parade in the world, and I definitely saw my life flash before my eyes a few times as we navigated these paved streets and all of the skyscrapers and very, very large crowds. But it was a heck of an experience. I think it gave me a better appreciation for what it must have been like to ride in things like the Panathenaic procession, which we'll talk about a bit more in a moment. Forward technology. There we go, okay. And I mean, certainly this modern lens is something that I was guilty of, for lack of a better term, when I started out in this field of hippology, of studying ancient horses and equestrianism. I fell into this habit of looking at it from what I knew, from what I had been told. I've been horse mad. I mean, I was bitten by the hippomania bug when I was a very little girl. And I have been crazy about horses since childhood. I started riding when I was 10, so 30 years ago. So horses have been a pretty consistent part of my life. Throughout childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood, my equestrianism was framed entirely in the structure of formal English riding. Dressage, hunters, jumpers, some eventing, right? For the most part, my riding took place in the confines of arenas, sometimes in fenced fields, with my saddle, stirrups, and fixation on proper equitation, and my coach constantly nagging me to have my shoulders back, heels down, thumbs up, and look up where I'm going, to ride in a quote-unquote proper way. Although I rode horses of all different breeds and backgrounds, from saintly schoolmasters to naughty ponies and slightly wild ex-race horses, my understanding of horses was, as I now realize, a wee bit confined and constrained. I thought I knew what it meant to ride properly. I thought I knew what a horse was and how we were supposed to do all of these things with them. But as I stumbled into my graduate research topic, I realized what I knew was only a very small part of a much bigger story. One of the first things I realized when I started down this path of equine history was just how important the horse was. Go into any ancient civ part of a museum and you are going to be inundated with horses. Seriously, start looking for them. They are absolutely everywhere, not just in the context of classical Greek art, but from across the ancient Eurasian world. And in almost every context and on every medium of visual culture that you can think of. They prance, snort, rear, pace, doze, eat, drink their way through the artistic record. Sometimes they might appear more abstract and sometimes almost hyper-realistic, but this pervasive presence of the horse made me stop and think about how and why people were depicting them. There has to be more than just a symbolic significance going on here. Yes, the horse is a status symbol, but the horse meant something more. So, Oh, and this is just me. So when I was working on my PhD and identifying ancient horse types, it meant that every time I went into a museum, I took photos of every single ancient horse in that museum, which is when I realized just how many there were. This was taken in the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul, which has a lot of horses, as do all the museums here in Athens. And it was in the basement, and I was hungry, and I'd been in there for hours, and I just wanted fresh air. And I thought I was almost done, and we're walking down sort of this dim basement hallway, and my friend came running up to me with this gleeful look on his face. And I'm exhausted, cameras drooping. He's like, I found the Thracian horse cult room. So this was me hitting my head against the door frame before finding a, 50th wind and going back in to take more photos of horses. So I know to eat now before I go into a museum, because there's going to be a lot of horses. So I took a step back from what I thought I knew. And I let go, to a general extent anyways, of the rules and regulations drilled into me about proper riding, and pretty much had my mind blown in terms of what you can actually do with a horse, that there are other ways to ride, train, and coexist alongside this animal. Over the years, I've ridden hundreds of miles in different countries as I tried to figure out the capabilities of different horse types in different contexts, using this to gain a better understanding of how and why ancient horse types looked the way they did, why people rode the way they did. I've ditched my saddles for long periods of time to embrace the technique of riding bareback. It is indeed doable. I've ridden in all sorts of historical saddles. The middle photo has me riding in a reproduction of a Roman cavalry saddle, and that is without stirrups, as I am throwing a javelin while jumping. I did hit the target, by the way. I was also in a department meeting. I have my earbuds in. I was multitasking. The joys of, I guess, the pandemic world. I've ridden in different types of armor while shooting bows, throwing javelins, couching lances, and swinging swords to figure out how and why people rode in particular ways in different historical contexts. In other words, I made a concerted effort to stop looking at ancient Greek horsemanship and other forms of ancient horsemanship and thinking, well, what they're doing isn't right, it isn't correct, it isn't effective, and etc., and instead seeing that, yes, it is different, but it's different for a reason. So I reframed my thinking to, instead of saying, well, what they're doing is wrong or what they're doing is impractical, now I say, why did they do it that way? What worked? What didn't work? What caused them to have horses like this or sit on their horse this way? Why were they successful? So I have kind of taken off my rose-colored glasses in terms of, English-centric riding and learned a whole lot about how you can ride a horse. And one of the reasons why this is possible is because of the animal itself. As archaeologists, as ancient historians, as classicists, so often we have to work with what we've been given, right? The material culture we find, the fragments of ancient civilizations, the bits of text that survive. But as I stepped outside my comfort zone and started looking at the horse differently, I realized that the horse really is a living artifact. The horses that we encounter today, whether it's going to be Stella here on the weekend, or champion race horses, or the Budweiser Clydesdales, or a chubby little Shetland pony, they all come from the same evolutionary background. They're equus caballus. Their bodies are physiognomically designed to survive in a certain environment. They are social prey animals with an ingrained flight instinct. So no matter how big or small they are, no matter what shape or size or color they take, a horse is a horse. And so I can get on a 21st century horse in Calgary, or Mongolia, or Tunisia, or South America, where I haven't been yet, but hope to go, and know that the general way that horse is going to move and respond and react to its environment isn't necessarily different from what it would have been like in antiquity. Because horses are a product of how they have evolved to survive. And so their fear responses, the way you train them, the things you need to be aware of, some of their idiosyncrasies, are consistent throughout history. And this has allowed me to really take a deep dive into how horses and equestrianism functioned in the ancient world. So what we're going to do now is a little bit of myth busting, all right? Looking at some of the preconceived notions we might have about ancient horses and ancient riding, and breaking down that, well, those ancient Greeks did actually know what they were doing. First of all, bigger isn't better, all right? You watch any sand and sword epic that is set in the ancient world, even the medieval world, and I can guarantee you, you are going to see a Frisian in there. They are the big black horses with all the mane and the furry legs. Colin Farrell rode one in that Alexander movie. Bucephalus was not a Dutch draft horse. Sorry, I hate to break it to you, he was not. Big horses simply didn't exist in antiquity. They also didn't exist in medieval Europe. There's some fantastic research coming out right now, or that's been coming out over the last few weeks, talking about the fact that, yeah, medieval war horses were what we would call pony size. We measure horses in a hand. A hand is the width of your palm, it's 4 inches, and you measure them from the ground to the withers at the base of their neck. In the modern vernacular, we call a pony anything that's 14.2 hands and under. But in antiquity, most horses would have been 14.2 hands and under, including the wonderful skeletons from Phaleron. Big horses are a product of the last couple hundred years of selective breeding. And although my horse Percival was wonderful, and as you can see, this is the giant horse that I'm standing in front of, he was a rescue horse, mostly Clydesdale. Yeah, he was a successful show horse. We had lots of adventures. But he was big, and being big made him very difficult to maintain. Finding equipment to fit him, he ate more food, he pooped more, he was more prone to injury because of how big he was. He didn't adapt to hot weather as well, right? The bigger they are, the harder it is for them to adjust, the longer it takes for their bodies to mature so that you can actually start doing serious work with them. And so, big horses, definitely, this is not meant to sort of, slag on big horses and say we don't need them. Yes, they have a particular purpose in our world today, but that purpose didn't exist in antiquity, right? And then the other horse is one of the horses I rode in Mongolia, who you can see is a lot smaller. But this horse is also a product of its environment. This horse can survive on the Mongolian steppe with very little human intervention, can trot and canter and gallop across the steppe for hours every day, going 15, 20 miles easily. May not be big and imposing, but serves a function that was necessary to survival in the ancient steppe and is still necessary to survival in the modern steppe. And so as I've traveled around riding sort of local, I don't like to use the term breed, local horse types in different parts of what would have been the ancient world that I study, there is one consistent factor. The horses are small. So the gray horse in the top corner, that was taken on Crete. That was one of my first riding adventures back in, 2007, I think. This is Mangus. He's a North African horse, but you'll see some Greek horses shortly as well. Underneath him is the little gray stallion I rode in Kyrgyzstan. In the center, that is a purebred Arabian former racehorse that I rode in Turkey. This was taken in Iznik, ancient Nicaea. And then we have another Mongolian horse over on the chestnut on the far side. He's not the most beautiful horse in the world, that is true, but he was tough as nails, sure-footed, and I certainly felt very comfortable in trusting my safety and security to him as we rode hundreds of miles across the Mongolian steppe. So what makes a horse strong, what makes a horse practical, is not how big it is, but how it's built, right? If we think about it in a practical perspective, the strongest horse in the world is the tiny Shetland pony. They were, coal horses. They can easily pull an adult in a cart, but they aren't very big. They're quite tiny. I suppose I should have put a photo of one in here for perspective's sake. So, and Xenophon talks about this in his text on horsemanship. What you want with a horse is a horse that is what we call close coupled. So it has a short back, right? The distance from its hindquarters to its neck is short. They have a broad back. They have good, dense, thick bone in their legs. They have sloping shoulders. They have solid hooves. This is what makes a horse strong. It's how they're built, their conformation, their proportions, not how tall they are. And we see a great example in the Dexilios stele. This is a short-backed, powerful horse. Some people read this image as what we call a levade. It's a high school training move for horses. It's very fancy and would be quite effective on the battlefield, I think. But we can see this horse has powerful hindquarters, nice shoulders, that nice short back with the rider sort of, seated nicely in the center of it, right? Everyone looks in control. You can see the power of this horse. This is a small horse, all right? But this horse has the power and sort of the oomph, the energy to be able to sort of push through another human, an infantry, or push against another horse. The power doesn't come from their size. Their power comes from their training, their fitness, their balance, and how well built their body is. I mean, likewise, we can look at any number of Greek vases, and again, you're going to see horses that are relatively small but well built, right? So that's one thing I want everyone to take away from this. Big doesn't equal strong, it's how the horse is built. Good hooves, good legs, a short back, a proportionate neck, a sloping shoulder, all right, nice hindquarters. This is what gives your horse power. And these smaller horses are actually almost easier to use for things like ancient battle. You know, Xenophon talks about what we call collection. And collection is basically shortening up the horse. If you think of like bouncing a basketball, right? It's the energy, the up and down, the up and down. When you're riding a horse into war, you don't want to gallop flat out as fast as you can. That's the worst thing you can do because you're going to lose your balance, you're going to lose your center of gravity, and you're going to lose control of your horse. The force, the power of the horse charging into an infantry formation or charging into another group of cavalry is the springing energy they have. It's like this coiled energy within their body. And the shorter kind of the horse's back and the more well-built their body is, the more compact they are, the easier it is to harness that energy. Yes, I could do that with my Clydesdale, but it was a lot harder, right? These compact, close-coupled horses are almost inherently designed for this. And to give you some examples of Greek horses, here we go. We have, her name was Selene. She was from the Patras region. Again, I wrote her on Crete. And you can see she is a small, compact horse. This isn't the greatest angle of her, but I do have some photos where it almost looks like you could Photoshop her onto the Parthenon frieze, and she's remarkably similar to what you see up there. We have Beauty, the Massara horse, or the Yorkolidico. We'll talk a bit more about them in a moment. And then the Pindos ponies from central Greece as well. These are all small, well-built, mountain-style horses, right? They are ideally designed for this environment. If they were really big, they would struggle to move through the mountainous, dry, rocky environment that is mainland Greece, right? They are perfectly designed for this place, for this climate, for the food that's available here, and for the weather that happens here. And of course, it needs to be pointed out that the riders of ancient Athens didn't have saddles and stirrups. The problem with really big horses is getting on. This is a wonderful vase that is in the Hippos exhibit. You had to get on. And although you could ask someone to boost you up, or you could find a handy rock or a log or a wall to scramble onto your big horse, that wasn't really practical. I mean, I always say, what are you going to do if you know the middle of the battle and you need to jump on another horse? Are you going to say, hey, can everyone stop the war for a minute so that I can get a boost up onto my horse? It's not going to work. You had to be able to jump on. And yes, there are people out there who seem to have springs built into their feet, and they can jump onto a 17.3 hand horse like my Percy. I am not one of them. The bigger the horse is, the harder it is to spring up. Whereas with a horse that's sort of 14.2 hands and under, even I can flail up on there in armor. I look a bit like a beached whale. It's not particularly pretty or elegant, but it works. And Xenophon does give some tips. What we're probably seeing in this black figure amphora is what Xenophon says you can use your javelin or your spear almost to kind of pole vault up onto your horse. But again, thinking that javelins and spears were sort of 7 to 8 feet long, if you have a giant horse, that's not going to work, right? The physics of it isn't going to work. So even for Xenophon's tricks, you need a smaller horse for it to be practical. Which of course brings us to this whole question of riding bareback, right? Open most books that talk about ancient cavalry, warfare, horses, and they get to that point where they talk about the fact that there were no saddles and stirrups, and this, meant they were limited in terms of what they could do. They're not as secure on the horse. You couldn't do shock cavalry. You couldn't do this. You couldn't do that because there were no saddles and stirrups. None of that is true. All right? You can do anything bareback that you can with a saddle and stirrups. It is all about what you know. Right? And this is where shaking off my own idea about riding was so important. I was taught to ride with a saddle and stirrups. So yes, when I started riding bareback, it was slightly terrifying. I felt like I was flailing around all over the place up there because I was used to a particular way of sitting on a horse. If you have never ridden with a saddle and stirrups, you don't know any different, right? Your body has learned to ride this way. And I will spend large parts of the winter riding bareback because it's warmer, it gets really cold in Calgary. And during the summer, when the horses are in the back 40, I'm not going to haul a saddle out there, so you ride bareback. And sure, when I first switch over, there's always a couple of rides that are a bit tentative, but I've jumped bareback, I hit things with swords and shot bows bareback. It's just a different technique. It's just a different way of doing it. When you ride with a saddle, whether it's a dressage saddle or a jumping saddle, a Western saddle, a medieval saddle, a Spanish saddle, a side saddle, pick a saddle, it's meant to sit you in a particular way that suits that discipline. Saddles have balance points, right? A jump saddle, so that's me on the gray horse. A jump saddle wants to put you forward so you can get up off the horse's back when you jump. A racing saddle makes you ride with tiny little stirrups, so you're like the jockey crouched over the horse's neck to be with their center of gravity. A dressage saddle, this is Charlotte Desjardins, she's one of the best, she's a multi-Olympic medalist with her incredible horse Filegro, right? A dressage saddle sits you deep. And when you have stirrups, you push your heels down, right? You sort of have, it's not a stiff leg position, but stirrups do help, but if you don't use them properly, they can be dangerous. That's why we have heels on our boots. If you don't push your weight down through your heels, then your foot is going to slide through the stirrup. And then if your horse decides to spook at an air molecule, as they do because they are prey animals who are afraid of everything, and you fall off, your foot is stuck in the stirrup, and no one wants to be dragged by a horse. It's a horrific thing. Don't let that happen to you. Right? So when you ride with a saddle, it sits you in a particular way. And when you switch from saddle to saddle, I've ridden in medieval saddles and Spanish saddles and jumping saddles and dressage saddles and all of these different things, they all take adjusting, right? Your body still has to get used to it. So it's not like there's one blanket way to use a saddle and stirrups. It's a technique you have to learn. So when you take that saddle away, your body position changes. Right? So here we see two examples, one from the Parthenon frieze and one from this black figure vase. Their heels aren't jammed down. And Xenophon says this. He says, your lower leg should be relaxed. It should be loose. Because as soon as you start gripping with that lower leg, if you don't have stirrups, your whole body becomes tense. And then you're just going to start bouncing around on the horse, and that's not fun for anyone. So when you see pictures of riders, ancient horse riders riding bareback, they always have this very loose lower leg, which then actually causes their whole body to relax down onto the horse because they're not holding themselves in a particular pose. There we go. So this is me again. I kind of exaggerated where I've got my knee pulled up on the far picture. I kind of exaggerated it, but pulling, if I had a saddle or if I was trying to ride bareback as if I had an English saddle, I'd be pulling my leg up and pushing my heel down, and that creates a different form of tension through not just my leg, but my entire body. And as the horse starts moving, I'm going to be a bit more precariously perched on top of him or her, right? And you can see riders who are learning to ride bareback, they'll do this. When they get nervous, they'll start clenching with their leg, and their knee creeps higher and higher and higher, and then they just bounce off the side of the horse. So don't do that. What you want to do is drop your leg down and relax your toes and keep your ankles loose, just like you see in all of the images of ancient riders. It's like they actually knew what they were doing, right? This sinks you down onto the horse and keeps your lower back relaxed so you don't start bouncing around like a tense 2x4 on top of the animal. And yes, I get it. Sure, art can be idealized. They're showing the best version of something, but the artist had to go off something they had seen, right? Clearly, there were people out there who could ride like this. If everyone riding in the Panathenaic procession was falling off of their horses, these images wouldn't have made sense. They wouldn't have been as important and effective as they were. And again, we look at these riders, and they're in a procession. It's tense. There's stuff going on. Their horses are probably fired up and spooking and anxious because there's all of these horses and riders together. There's all of the sacrificial animals, all of this stuff going on. These are not going to be calm, relaxed, mellow horses. And yet you look at the riders, and they're pretty relaxed up there. Their whole body language is just soft on this horse. They're not clenching. They don't look scared. They don't look anxious. And they're doing it bareback. Right? Because this is how they know, this is the type of riding that they know. Same thing when we look at scenes of warfare. The coin by Alexander of Pherae, I quite like this one because you can see one of the advantages of riding bareback, especially on smaller horses, is you can communicate with the horse in very subtle ways because there's no equipment between you, right? So if we see our rider here, you can see his outside leg is further forward because he's pivoting his hips and he's turning his horse towards his foe, not by pulling on the horse's mouth, but by using his body to move the animal. And so his inside leg swings back as he brings his shoulders and his hips around, right? So we're seeing riding body language here, and without the saddle, you can do that in a much more subtle way. Your horse can feel you quite differently. And I love the scene from the Alexander sarcophagus. I mean, this horse is rearing up. You've got the chaos chaos of battle. And again, the rider is twisting his torso around to stab down. And he doesn't look off balance. He doesn't look like, oh, I'm going to do this and fall off right away. He's completely in control of his animal and himself. Why? Because riding bareback is what he's done his entire life. If you gave him a saddle and stirrups, he'd probably find it terrible. He probably wouldn't like it at all because it would feel completely different. And then, of course, sports, right? We have all these wonderful scenes of the Kelleys races, the racehorses on Panathinaik Amphora. And again, they're sitting a bit different from what you would see a modern jockey doing by sitting a little bit further back. But these are photos from the Naadam races in Mongolia. It's part of their big festival. The jockeys are all children between 5 and 12 years old, both boys and girls. These races are on average, I think, about 15 to 20 kilometers long. Saddles are completely optional. And the kids have to ride to the start line before they race all the way back. So this is at the end of a 20-kilometer race, and I just love that, I mean, you look at the posture of these kids who are completely comfortable on these tiny little racehorses, and they echo what you're seeing in the Panathinaik Amphora. So again, there's a reason why they're doing things the way they're doing them. It's not just artistic license, or it's not that they didn't know better. It's a response to the horses that they had. And just a quick example, I mean, people still ride bareback today. There's a video, I think the high jump record for bareback was set several years ago by a British rider, part of a famous family, the Whitakers. And I think he jumped 2.2 meters bareback over a big wall. We see Laura Collette, she's in the top corner, jumping her horse over 1.85 meters. You have in Indonesia, they do a mounted game where they throw spears at each other, and it's done bareback. We have a Sikh horseman in the bottom corner who again is doing tent pegging bareback. And then there's of course the famous palio races in Italy, which are also run bareback. So it is doable. It's just about practice, right? Whether you have saddles and stirrups or not, what makes you a good rider is not your equipment. The only thing keeping you on your horse is your saddle. You have bigger issues. It's practice. And Xenophon talks about this all the time in both of his horsey texts, right? Constantly reminding you to practice what you're doing. That's the only way you're going to become a good rider. Then, of course, there's the question of the chair seat, right? So when you see these images of riders sitting in the chair seat or the donkey seat, and I used to be very dismissive of this. It's not correct. It's not what Xenophon describes. It's not what you're supposed to do. But again, if you dig a little bit deeper, there's a reason for it. So if we look at these 3, or I guess 4 examples, one is the same Kylix, but of these riders in their chair seat, they look pretty comfortable. You know, they don't look uncomfortable. They don't look like they're about to fall off. They look like they know what they're doing. So why are they sitting like this? There's a couple of interesting explanations. Possible explanations. One is the horses themselves. So you get within the horse world some breeds or types of horses that are what we call gaited. So all horses will walk, trot, canter, and gallop. Some horses have extra gaits, a tolt, a pace, a rack, a running walk, a 5th gait, or a 6th gait. And you do see that in the Mediterranean. There are some references, possible references to gaited horses in the textual tradition. Certainly, so the Cretan horse, the Massara horse, the Yorka Lidico, the fast walker, tolts. And when I rode Beauty, she did tolts. It's incredibly comfortable. These gaited horses are the smoothest things you'll ever ride. The Icelandic horse tolts in Turkey, they have the pacing races for these gaited horses as well. But when you're riding these gaited horses, you do tend to sit further back in what we would call a chair seat. So it's possible that in some cases we're seeing a chair seat because of how the horses moved. That's just how you rode them. Come on, go ahead. Are we going to? There we go. Oh, geez, went too far. Technologically cursed, like I said. But it's also when you're just relaxed on the horse, when you don't have a saddle to hold you in a particular position, if you're just ambling along, going for a stroll, or jogging along in a relaxed way, that's where gravity will naturally put your legs. If you're not bringing your leg intentionally underneath you, your leg just kind of swings out in front of you. And once I started looking at all sorts of pictures of me riding bareback, and when I'm just sort of relaxed on the horse, not really doing anything serious, my body would naturally shift into this role, or into this position. So the image closest to me in the middle one, it's sort of my leg just hanging naturally, right? Kind of popping in front of me, and it relaxes my whole body onto the horse. The far image where I've jammed my heel down, then again my body starts to get stiff. So if I were to try to ride my horse in this position, I would become very stiff and bounce all over, and it wouldn't be fun, and my horse probably wouldn't like it. But when I'm relaxed and just let my legs swing forward nice and loose, right, you're sort of gripping a bit with your thighs, and it's comfortable, the horse seems to like it. And then if I want my horse to start doing something more difficult, then I bring my leg underneath me, right? Then it's more like what you see on the Parthenon frieze, where I sit up a bit more and I sort of relax my knee and bring my heels underneath me to say to my horse, pick yourself up, collect yourself. We're going to start doing something now. So the posture of the rider tells the horse, what the horse should be doing, how the horse should be feeling. Are we just relaxing, or are we going to do some work? And again, bareback, these subtle changes become much more noticeable to the animal. And then, riding aside, small horses and bareback aside, again, we look at Greek art and we just see horses being horses. I love this. It was one of the things that, again, drove me down this path, that these aren't just symbolic representations. They are real animals. So the middle photo, it's my dog, very muddy dog in the front. But this is after a long ride during the summer, bareback. Pulled the bridles off and let our two horses, Bert and Percy, go. And of course, the first thing they do is drop and roll, right? Get all the sweat off of them. And we see that in this wonderful black figure amphora, where you've got the two horses kind of goofing around in the middle, and then the horse rolling behind them, just being a horse. And then we have all of these coins from Larissa that may show a horse about to roll. It could be something else, but they're sort of pawing at the ground and starting to go down. This is the pose you see of a horse who is about to lie down. This could also be something else, but it's still a naturalistic pose. We have scenes of horses being groomed, right? Just sort of the everyday behind-the-scenes stuff. Yes, the Kylix of Cupid's stables does have little Arotes figures jumping around on the horses because it's a bit more mythological. But sort of the hubbub of the stable, of tying these horses, brushing them, cleaning them, moving around them, this is something that you'll see in any stable, even today. And then the Kylix with the groom and the horse. What we think is going on in this is he's brushing the horse, and now he's just blowing the dust, the dander, off the brush, so you can go back to cleaning the horse again. So something you still do. Horses are very dusty, and so you clean your brushes off as you're brushing them. It's this sort of rhythmic movement that you go through. I love this fragment. I was just blown away the first time I saw it. It doesn't look like much. So we have our warrior and we have a horse, but if you look, you can see a little bit of a lead rope, right? This soldier is letting his horse graze. And that's me hand grazing a horse at a horse show. Horses graze. It's what they're supposed to do. They like eating grass. It's very relaxing for them, but you're not always in a situation where you can turn them loose in a field. So what do? You hand graze them. You put their halter on and you lead them out to a grassy field and you hang on to them while they eat. And it's a way that you bond with them, that you let them have some downtime, and we're seeing that in this fragment, right? So this idea of hand grazing your horse isn't just a modern idea. It's clearly something that we've been doing with our horses for a very long time. And the image that kind of started it all in terms of recognizing that we're seeing horses being real is this one, right? Block 12 from the West Frieze of the Parthenon. The first time I saw it, my jaw dropped. I was like, oh my God, that's not a fancy horse in a procession. It's a horse scratching its nose. And Mercury loves to scratch his nose, so I was really excited when I got this photo a couple weeks ago. But it's just they're rubbing the sweat off their nose. Their leg is itchy, right? This is a horse being a horse, but it's being a horse on the Parthenon, right? This isn't a little minor monument. We're seeing a horse doing a very real horsey behavior, right, on this magnificent frieze. Which brings us to the horse-human bond. I could talk about this, endlessly, but I'm not going to do that to you. But often I think when we consider the horse-human relationship, especially in the pre-modern world, especially in the pre-industrialized world, we think, oh, well, horses were tools. They were pieces of equipment. They were status symbols. They were, they went to war. They raced. Eventually, they started doing agricultural work. They were used for transportation. But we, I think, often come in with this impression that horses were viewed as objects, not as beings. In the story of Alexander and Bucephalus, yeah, maybe Plutarch exaggerates things a little bit, but this idea that young Alexander, in section 6 of Plutarch's Life of Alexander, the stallion is brought in and he's wild and he's unrideable, and Philip's like, "What are you doing? Why are you trying to sell me this horse? Do you want to kill me?" And precocious Alexander is like, "Dad, you're being a fool. It's the best horse here." This horse is rearing and throwing all of Philip's best men. No one can sit on this horse. But Alexander noticed that the horse was just afraid of his shadow. which might sound ridiculous, but horses are, I've had horses be afraid of their shadows. They really are afraid of everything. And so the horse was scared. And when an animal is scared, they can have two reactions, run away or fight. And if the animal can't run away, they're going to find some way to dispel that energy. And for Bucephalus, it was rearing and throwing people and biting and trying to say, I'm afraid. And so Alexander turns him into the sun, so he can't see his shadow anymore, jumps on and lets him run his nervous energy out, realize he's not going to be punished, and then the horse calms down, and of course this magical relationship starts. Yes, it's a wonderful tale, but it does tell us something. I mean, it's a very Alexander tale, but when you think about it, I mean, riding a horse to war seems like a really ridiculous idea. They are afraid of their shadows, and we're saying, go gallop into those sharp, pointy things over there. It's totally going to be fine. Don't worry about it. We got this. And they did it, and they didn't do it because we beat them and we yelled at them and we made them do it. That would never have worked, right? When you're riding your horse, and I mean, I've never had to go to war, thankfully, but I think it's pretty fair to say that when you're riding your horse onto the battlefield, you in the back of your mind, you don't want to be thinking, he's only doing this because I'm making him, or because he's afraid. You don't want to ride a fearful horse onto the battlefield. Your horse is your partner, is responsible for keeping you alive. If I'm hacking away at someone over here and someone starts running towards us, I want my horse to be aware of that and to save us, to get us out of there. And throughout the history of the war horse, there are stories about this. Horses carrying their riders to safety, right? Even after they've been injured, even if the rider is unconscious, getting them back to a safe place. So when we think about the horses and riders of antiquity, yes, I mean, were there some people who owned horses simply because they were a status symbol? Of course. But they spent a lot of time with these animals. They trained with them. They traveled on them. They kept them, in their stable yards. They had them painted. They had sculptures made of them. Horses had, we have names for horses. And when you name an animal, you start anthropomorphizing it, right? Names carry power. And there are lots of references to named horses in the Greek tradition. And the thing about horses, and this is kind of what I want to leave everyone with, is they weren't objects to the Greeks, or at least certainly not to most of the Greeks. They named them, they rode them, they knew what they liked and didn't like, and every horse has a distinct personality, right? Bucephalus would have a personality. Ofthe, the racehorse, would have a certain personality. And their riders, their owners, their grooms, people who work with them would have known this. That's how you forge the bond with the horse and actually have a successful relationship with them, where you can ride them and do all of these things. And I was reminded of this, that every horse is different. I lost my two horses at the end of last year. It was horrific. My great partners, Bert and Percy, who I'd worked with for over 15 years. Those horses could read my mind. Quite literally. I could get on them and knew exactly what they were going to do. They knew what I was going to do. It was this very sort of equal relationship of just being able to understand one another, even though we were two different species. So now I've started working with some new horses. And it's just this important reminder that as much as we have our Xenophon says you should do this and so on and so forth, and those are good general rules, but every horse is unique. And so this is a new horse I'm working with, Mercury, and he's very different from Bert and Percy, and it's kind of like starting over, right? Forging that new relationship. And this isn't just something that belongs to the 21st century, right? Whether you're me in 21st century Calgary, or a member of the Athenian cavalry in the 5th century BCE, you had to know your horses, and you had to know who they were, because they were animals. They were a part of your life and your society, not just an object or a status symbol. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for reminding us about many, the relationship and the size of the horse. I remember doing this research that the earliest horse fossils or bones we have, it's a tiny thing. It's like a dog, and so they progressively got bigger through breeding and survival and whatever. And about the short back. They've now done some DNA studies on the Equus caballus, the one surviving horse of all the original types, and the genomes from the DNA, two of them stand out. One is that the horse has a short back, and the other one is that they're stress averse. They can handle stress. So that means they'd be good in the battle. So that's
yeah,
probably,
and from a physiological perspective, most horses are going to have the same number of vertebrae in their spine. So the longer their back is, the weaker the vertebrae become because there's more distance between them. So there is an act like, in terms of the soundness of the animal and sort of keeping their backs strong and healthy and preventing injury, the shorter back is easier to maintain than the long back, because the longer the back is, the more strain you put on the spine.
they get sway back or whatever, yeah. Okay, are there questions out there in the audience? We have a few here. Okay. I'll take the one in the audience.
Thank you. It was a very interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question on the scale of what we're seeing on the Parthenon frieze, where to my eye, and I think a lot of people's eye, the horses seem very scaled down. But with your work, do you see that in terms of the scale, or do you think that we're looking at a somewhat accurate representation?
I would say you're looking at a pretty accurate representation. Not just because, the horse, if you go out and look at the horses in the Greek countryside today, if they haven't been sort of imported from elsewhere, they are all around that size. For scale for those photos, I'm 5'7", and most of the Greek horses I rode would have come up to sort of about, here to here on me. So it's a pretty accurate scale, and I always point out, look at the other animals on the Parthenon frieze, the sacrificial animals, right? They're, again, reasonably to scale. So I don't think that they're intentionally, there wasn't a deliberate choice on the part of the sculptors to make the horses look smaller, especially given how important the horse was and how prominent they were as a status symbol and what they represented. You're looking at a pretty accurate representation. Those are small horses, but powerful horses.
There are a couple questions here about size. Asking if you could comment on the distinction between a pony and a small horse, and how does the smaller size of ancient horses affect their ability to pull carts?
Sure. As I sort of hinted at, now we tend to use the terms of horse and pony as size designations, all right? So a pony, if you were going to an English horse show and you wanted to enter the pony division, your animal would have to be under 14.2 hands or under. If it's more than 14.2 hands, then it's considered a horse. In antiquity, they wouldn't have used those designations because you wouldn't have had many horses that were more than 14.2 hands. 15 hands would have been considered quite large. So they were just smaller horses. Usually with traditionally we say with the term pony that it's referring to particular physiognomic features. So when you look at true pony breeds, and a lot of them sort of come from the Northern European area, their proportions are a bit different from what we call small horses, right? They tend to have stockier legs, the overall appearance of them is slightly sturdier than horses. So what they were riding in, the Greeks or the Romans or the Egyptians, they would not have called their horses ponies. They were just horses. They were just smaller horses. They didn't have that designation. The designation horse and pony is a much more modern, in terms of the spectrum of equine history, a much more modern creation.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, Nigel?
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I have just a couple of quick questions about the technology. Surely some of the effectiveness of the horse would have been diminished by their not having any horseshoes in antiquity, as I understood. That the horses' hooves would be very prone to disease, especially in the rocky atmosphere of Greece. And a related question has to do with the bits. It always struck me, the tendency of your talk was that the Greeks loved their horses, but when you look at the bits, you see some of them didn't.
Yes. Yeah, those
are
are
absolutely horrific, some of those bits.
Those are both fantastic questions. So in terms of horseshoes, certainly the Greeks wouldn't have had shoes, but, and this is where having And yes, certainly there are, there's a passage in Thucydides about the Athenian cavalry at Decelea, and they're riding out day in, day out, and their horses start to go footsore because, it's hot and it's dry, and they're riding on this rocky terrain. And it's more the repeated use and probably long days out patrolling that are causing the horses to go footsore. When you look at horse types that, basically have been produced in rocky environments, they actually tend to have quite strong hooves. So not every horse needs shoes. And Xenophon says in his text on horsemanship, he compares it to the foundation of a house. He said, and we still say this, no hoof, no horse. It's like one of the oldest sayings in horse ownership. When you're going to go buy a horse, always look at their feet first. If they have bad feet, you can still buy the horse, but it's going to be a lot more difficult to keep that horse sound. And so, yes, some horses would probably have had poor feet. They wouldn't have done well in the cavalry. So if you're looking at the horses being sort of naturally produced in this environment, these sort of rugged mountain horses that are designed to be able to go over this rocky terrain, they wouldn't have been as hampered as you think about the lack of shoes. I've ridden plenty of horses that go what we call barefoot, that have never had shoes on in their life and do perfectly fine in all sorts of different situations. Again, it just comes down to how they're built and how good their feet are and finding the right job for them. And then yes, the bits. There are some truly horrific bits out there, and I suppose I should have prefaced this by saying that not every Greek horse person would have been wonderful. Same thing today. Some people have a natural skill for riding. Some people are, they practice really hard and they get very good at it. Other people don't care as much, and they want the horse for what it represents. That certainly happened in ancient Athens, and it still happens today. So we do, there's the bit that's in the National Museum that is like, whoa, what is that? But we always say that a bit is only as harsh as the hand that holds it. So, and I'm not saying go and put these big bits in your horse's mouth, but you look at some bits, even some of the bits that Western riders use, they're called spade bits, and they have this sort of piece and the Romans use something similar that sort of rotates up into the roof of the horse's mouth. But the idea is that you're barely holding the reins. The same thing with medieval bits, right? Your reins are very, very looped so that you don't have this constant hold on the horse's face. So yes, they have this big bit in their mouth, but you're barely twitching your fingers to control them. So that when you're wearing your armor and you're doing all of this stuff, you know that just the barest twitch can make the horse move or stop or do whatever you're asking it. If you were to, yes, try and hang on to their mouth, that would be terrible. So, but at the same time, we also see what we call simple snaffle bits, where there's just the plain mouthpiece with the joint in the middle. And Xenophon talks about different kinds of bits. He says use a rough bit and a smooth bit, and there's different purposes for them. But were there people who would have used horrific bits and used them in a horrific way? Yes, of course. That's unfortunately been something that I think has existed for as long as we've been putting bits in horses' mouths. But there also would have been very skilled riders who would have a strong bit in their horse's mouth and would have ridden in a very soft and gentle way, kind of the ideal that Xenophon describes. So with the technology, it just depends on how you use it. But I'm not saying go and put one of those giant barbed Greek bits in your horse's mouth. Please don't do that. But it did serve a particular purpose at the time. Because when you're, especially on the battlefield, the last thing you want is for your horse to be ignoring the direction that you're giving it. And so, yes, there, I suppose, was some logic behind them. But it's the type of bit that you should know what you're doing before you try and do anything with it.
Okay, Hector Williams reminds us that there's an old cavalry song called 40 Miles a Day on Beans and Hay, and asked, do we know how far normally cavalry could cover in antiquity in a day?
Oh, geez. Oh, Hector. It would depend. It would depend on terrain. It would depend on the weather. It would depend on how much weight the horses were carrying. This isn't ancient Greece, but if you look at the Genghis Khan, he developed a messenger system in Mongolia, which is, the Persians has to be like this too, sort of the earliest versions of the Pony Express, which the Americans were not the first ones to come up with that idea, of way stations. So, the version in Mongolia, I think there were 40 kilometers between each post. And the idea was the messengers could just gallop that whole time. So they would get on a fresh horse with their note and gallop from one way station to the next, jump on another fresh horse and keep going. these are fit horses that are very good at endurance, and we certainly have modern endurance, the sport of modern endurance racing. Some of the races are 100 miles long, and I think you do them in 24 hours. I mean, again, these are specialized, very fit horses. So could you have done that in antiquity? Yes, but it wouldn't have been the ideal because you don't want to tire your horse out. But yeah, trying to guesstimate how far cavalry could ride in a particular day. I mean, to have them do probably 15 to 20 kilometers under ideal conditions certainly wouldn't have been impossible. And then under pressure, if they had the right types of horses, you could definitely do more. If you had good ground and good weather, and the horses weren't tired, so.
Okay, Rush Rem writes that he was actually at the Calgary Stampede in 1967, and he recalls that there was a lot of alcohol being drunk at it, and he wonders if the ancients used any kind of booze or drugs to enhance horse capabilities. He's thinking about, in reference to some of the destructive doping, that goes on in racing today.
Well, that's just, for the riders, that's just liquid courage. I mean, I have known horses that had been taught to drink beer. Again, don't teach your horse to drink beer, but it is, I suppose, a barley product. And I think in Ireland, it's a very traditional thing to give your racehorses Guinness because it's very strong in iron, to pour a can of Guinness into their feed. I don't know of any, I mean, in terms of drugging or doping horses in antiquity, they wouldn't really have had anything to do that with. None of these anti-inflammatories and steroids and stuff and masking drugs that, because really when there is the unfortunate thing of drugging racehorses and sport horses today, it's usually to mask pain more than to sort of make them faster. Right, so if they're sore or something's swollen or whatever, you don't do this again. You're not supposed to, but a way of trying to cover that up. I don't think there would have been a way of doing that in antiquity, but I would say yes, the riders probably would consume alcohol. I mean, I always love telling the stories about this. I mean, in Central Asia, and Strabo talks about this. He calls the Scythians, I think it's Strabo, calls them the hippomolgoi, the mare's milk drinkers. Horse milk is a huge part of the diet in Central Asia. It still is. And it's fermented. It's alcoholic horse milk. It's about 5% alcohol. It's not pasteurized. Traditionally made in sort of a goat skin bag. Yeah. I quite like it. It's an acquired taste. My husband, if you even mention Era agricumus to him, he just turns gray. He didn't have quite so positive experience drinking alcoholic horse milk. So it is mildly alcoholic, but it's also horse milk has the highest content of vitamin C of any dairy product in the world. So when you're nomadic and you don't eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, that's why our Scythians didn't get scurvy. But yes, had that bit of alcohol. And then they can further distill it now into something that's like 40 proof and kind of like, I don't know, some sort of moonshine horse milk alcoholic vodka thing. It gets really cold there in the winter though, so we need anything you can to keep you warm.
Okay, Joan Mertens has a question in relation to the Monteleone chariot, that wonderful Etruscan work of art in the Metropolitan Museum. Would horses pulling chariots or carts have been different from, I guess, racing horses and cavalry horses? That's
a great question. Based on the evidence we're seeing, no. So, I mean, once you get into the Roman period and sort of texts like Columella, Columella refers to sort of like 3 different classes of horses, the noble horses that were like the race horses, and then the war horses, and then the everyday horses. But this doesn't seem to be a reference necessarily to selective breeding for particular jobs. It just is more that these are the types of horses being bred in certain areas, and some are better bred and more, apt to racing or war, and others are less apt. So I don't, and when you look at the art, whether you're looking at a racehorse or a ridden racehorse or a chariot horse or a horse in a procession or a horse in the battlefield, they all look pretty similar. Like their proportions, their conformation, their physiognomic features are all pretty similar to one another. So I sort of have this feeling that in the Greek, especially certainly in the Greek world, they weren't necessarily trying to breed horses sort of line breed them to do a really specific job. They were breeding good horses to suit the environment, and some would be better suited as racehorses, some would be better suited as war horses. So, the horses that would have pulled chariots, and one of the things to point out, actually, one of the reasons why horses weren't used to pull plows, they weren't used for sort of gritty agricultural work, is because the horse collar wasn't invented until the Middle Ages. And so the type of harness you would put on, say, a donkey to pull a cart won't work on a horse, it'll choke them. So if they were trying to pull anything really, really heavy, it could actually impede their windpipes. That's why we see them pulling lighter chariots as opposed to doing heavy traction work, which was more the job of donkeys and oxen. So yes, I suppose long answer to that question. The horses pulling that chariot probably, they might have been maybe a little bit broader across the chest, maybe, they would have been chosen for a reason, but in terms of their overall appearance, it would have been similar to other horses you were seeing.
Okay, are there any questions out in the audience? Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and it's about dressing the horses' manes or tails in antiquity.
Well, so we know what happens. When you look, again, the Parthenon frieze is a really good example of this, and you see it a fair bit, especially in classical Greek art, with what we call the roached mane. So they cut the mane quite short, so it's almost like a mohawk, and that was probably for safety. So that your hands wouldn't get tangled in the mane, especially if a horse has a really, really thick mane. When you're trying to manage your reins and your spear and all of this stuff, you don't want your hands to get all tangled up. And polo ponies, it's tradition with polo ponies, again, to shave their mane off, to roach their mane, so that as you're galloping around like this and swinging your mallet, nothing's going to get tangled. We see, it's certainly, there's some, well, the beautiful bronze head next to us. The horse has a top knot, so his forelock has been tied up. Mm-hmm. I can't think of specific examples, but I have seen braiding put in the tail as well. Certainly from Assyria, there are some beautiful Assyrian reliefs and Neo-Assyrian reliefs that again show the forelock kind of tied up off the horse's face and different sort of, I guess, ribbons or strings put in. So yes, there is evidence that the mane and tail were groomed or sometimes presented in certain ways or braided and stuff like that, or just cut off. And again, my big Clydesdale horse, Percy, he had this massively thick mane. And so I roached it a few times because it was, one, really hard to take care of. If you didn't brush it constantly, it would turn into dreadlocks. And when it was really hot during the summer, it was a lot of weight on his neck and he was always sweating. So when he was younger, I'd roach it, and then, more recently, I would just put it into braids so that this heavy hair wasn't always hanging on his neck when we were working, because he would just be drenched underneath. So yes, there is evidence for grooming manes and tails in particular ways.
Yeah, certainly they appreciated the beauty of the horse's mane, and in the Iliad, we're told that Achilles' horses' manes were treated with olive oil, yes, to make them shiny and beautiful.
And now we just put detangler in them. Spray them with, don't spray the detangler if you're going to braid it, though, because then it becomes impossible. But if you're not going to braid it, then yes, you spray like a detangler in there so that the hair doesn't get all matted and knotted.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I want to remind people that we'll have another lecture coming up. We have 2 more coming up. Next week, it will be Carol Touche talking about Xenophon, and then the week after that, it will be Marianne Everly who's going to talk about the wonderful horse dedications on the archaic Acropolis. So please come back and join us. And those of you who are here, we're not serving mare's milk downstairs, but you can come and have a glass of wine and talk a little more with our speaker. So let's thank her again.